Okay, this is just a short video again on development. The last bullet point is other indicators of development. So let's speak for 5 or 10 minutes or so on that. So to start off, again, just as a recap, we know that economic development measures the quality of life within a country. There are many factors that affect the quality of life. Therefore, economic development is very difficult to measure within a country over time or between different countries because there's so many different variables that we could possibly measure. So some of these we've talked about before. So per capita income, obviously that affects development because the more income that people earn, the more goods and services that the households will be able to consume. And the more they're able to consume, the greater the utility that the households will receive, and thus the higher the quality of life in material terms. You could also say that, or make an argument to say that you could look at suicide rates. I would say there's a negative correlation between economic development and a country's suicide rate. So people who commit suicide are often, well, normally they're very unhappy. That's why they do it. So you could argue that in countries that have particularly high rates of suicide, the level of economic development is probably pretty low. People are unhappy. The distribution of income, you could say that that affects development. The distribution of income, it's the degree of spread around the mean average per capita income. In general, income inequality tends to reduce the level of development because a big gap between the rich and the poor is statistically linked to status anxiety, which is an important cause of depression and other mental illnesses. Crime rates also tend to be higher in countries where there's a bigger gap between rich and poor in terms of either income or wealth. Another variable that we could consider is CO2 emissions per capita. You could argue that the level of economic development falls when pollution rises within society. Pollution reduces the quality of environmental goods. Remember, environmental goods are aspects of nature that generate utility for households. And environmental goods, unlike conventional goods and services, are not sold in conventional markets. Therefore, there's no market price for an environmental good like fresh air. But that doesn't mean that fresh air doesn't have a positive economic value, and thus we should value it. Another good example of an environmental good might be an unpolluted river that people can either swim or fish in. And yeah, again, the quality of a country's stock of environmental goods certainly affects the non-material aspect of economic development. Infant mortality is another factor you could consider. The standard way of measuring this is to look at the number of children who were born who survive until their 5th birthday. The lower that is, the greater the level of economic development. Literacy rates, yep, you could argue that the quality of life is positively affected by education because education increases productivity, which is output per worker. So if productivity rises, the economy will experience long-run economic growth because the same workforce will now be able to produce more in total if each worker is adding more to GDP. This in turn should increase per capita incomes, leading to greater levels of consumption. In addition, education enables households to access literature that enhances their well-being. Finally, there's also a positive correlation between education and democracy. In countries where literacy rates are high, politicians are more likely to be held to account by their electorate. This is because literacy enables the population to access information about the government and its activities. Working hours, you could say, is another factor that affects economic development. Economists assume that leisure time generates utility. The opportunity cost of working longer hours is reduced leisure time. Working longer hours might increase incomes, boosting consumption, adding to material living standards. However, due to the loss of leisure time created by working longer hours, an individual's quality of life might not improve if we all just work longer hours. The material benefits might be less than the non-material loss. Freedom of speech, privacy and association, that's another factor, another variable that you should really take into account when measuring development. In an economically developed country, people have the right to say and write whatever they want to do without fear of censorship or imprisonment. In countries that have low levels of economic development, the government imprisons citizens without trial. In addition, whistleblowers who don't obey the state's consensus are imprisoned for their heresy. Democracy, you could argue that this adds to the quality of life, so we should take it into account when measuring development. The government should represent the electorate, not big business. In an economically developed country, ordinary citizens should be able to influence the big decisions made within their country via the ballot box. Gender and racial equality is obviously very important. Regardless of background, an individual should have the opportunity to develop in line with their aptitude and inclination towards hard work. Finally, you could argue that social mobility should be taken into account within any assessment of economic development. This social mobility is the ability to move between social classes during one's lifetime. Social mobility is positively correlated with economic development. An individual's income should be determined by their intelligence and effort, not the individual's family background and connections. There are a few other composite indicators that you might want to know about. If we talk about the multi-dimensional poverty index first, the MPI is a measure of absolute poverty that was designed by Oxford University. The MPI is calculated by assessing an individual's health, education and living standards as measured via 10 variables. And those variables are infant mortality, nutrition, years of schooling, school attendance, cooking fuel, toilet facilities, clean running water, electricity, floor space and household assets, whether a household has any wealth or not. A household is considered to be multi-dimensionally poor if they're considered to be deprived in more than 3 out of the 10 indicators of poverty. The MPI also measures the intensity of poverty. A household who is deprived in 8 variables will be considered to be poorer than a household who is deprived in just 4 of the variables. So if you looked at the UK at the moment, child mortality is fairly low. Nutrition, well, some people are malnourished through their own choice. There's plenty of cheap, fresh fruit and vegetables available, but many people in Britain are malnourished because they prefer KFC popcorn chicken instead. Years of schooling are good, very high, but again, does that automatically indicate development? You could have quite a high average mean years of schooling, but does that always indicate development? A lot would depend on what's being taught and how it's being taught, surely. It's not just the quantity of education, the quality of education is important too. So what else have we got? Some people argue that the proportion of the male population working in agriculture is a proxy for the level of economic development. These people view agriculture in an unfavourable light. So they would say if a high proportion of the workforce is engaged in agriculture, that indicates low levels of development. And what economists like Rostov, for example, would recommend is industrialization. So take people off the land, put them in factories, start manufacturing, and the proportion of the workforce employed in agriculture would fall and that indicates development according to them. What else have we got? Energy consumption per capita. Some economists assert that a high level of energy consumption is an indicator of an economically developed country. Poor developing countries consume very little energy per capita. They think that this is a bad thing, that people haven't got access to electronic gadgets and cars. It indicates low levels of development. I'm not quite sure how that stacks up, especially given that we've got climate change allegedly. One that's fairly logical is the proportion of the population who have access to clean water. You could argue that clean water influences development because it affects the duration and quality of life. Some economists would argue that access to clean water is a basic human right. By implication, those who don't have access to clean water must be living in absolute poverty, so therefore low levels of development. Other people, there's a million and one different variables that you could consider when measuring development. Some people look at internet users as a percentage of the population, or you might look at mobile phone ownership, and the higher those percentages, the more developed a society is. Again, I'm not completely convinced by this. Has the quality of life in Britain really improved as a result of the rollout of smartphones? People in restaurants, or people who are going out to the pub or wherever, don't even talk to each other. They've just got their head in their phone. Is that really economic development? I don't know. It all depends on your subjective preferences. Okay, that's it.